everybody, welcome back to Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. It's another great Monday night. I've got another great show for you in store for you tonight. If you are new to the show, make sure you know the rules. Chime in and say hello. Type in where you're tuning in from in the world. Let us know where you're from. Say hello. And if you have currently been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, that's tonight's topic, the rise of autoimmune disease. Let me know. Type in yes AID, right? That's what we want. We want to hashtag yes AID, autoimmune disease. I'd like to see how many of you are actually struggling with this problem tonight as we get diving into the information. So, as always, our mission here at Dr. Peter Osborne and glutenfreesociety.org is to help save 100 million lives through empowering knowledge and information. And so as we're reaching out to you, if you find this information is helpful, make sure you offer it up to somebody you know. Hit the share button below, copy the URL, send it to a relative, send it to a friend, send it to a cousin, send it to a mom or a dad or a son or a daughter, somebody you care about, especially with tonight's topic, if they struggle with autoimmune disease. Now, let's dive into autoimmunity, and you're going to want to pay attention to this whole show tonight because I'm going to be talking about some things that are very, very, well, we'll just say they're shoved aside or shoved under the rug. Most doctors will completely dismiss what I'm going to tell you tonight, so you want to pay attention to the very end because I'm going to talk about some really great strategies that you can implement to overcome autoimmune problems. So, let's talk about autoimmune disease. Autoimmune disease, there are an estimated 50 million people just in the U.S. So if you're not tuning in the U.S. tonight, no, this is a number that is U.S. alone. That means 1 in 7. So if you're in a room full of 49 people, that means 7 of those 49 people are going to have an autoimmune diagnosis or going to have some form of autoimmune disease. So the number is quite high, 50 million. Now, if we put this into perspective between cancer and heart disease, for example, cancer affects 9 million people a year. Heart disease affects 22 million people a year. That's a total of 31 million if you combine them both. And again, these are U.S. statistics. Autoimmune disease, 50 million. It almost doubles cancer and heart disease combined. And actually, if you took many forms of cancer for what they are, end-stage autoimmune disease, if you took many forms of heart disease for what they are, a lot of your different forms of heart disease, your cardiomyopathies and inflammatory heart issues are actually forms of autoimmune disease. So if you rerouted some of the statistics around cancer and heart disease to actually call it what it was, autoimmune disease, this number would climb dramatically. So it's very, very important that you understand this is a very, very prolific problem in our society today. 1 in 7 people that you see on the street, that you see at an event, that you see at a family gathering are going to have an autoimmune diagnosis, and the numbers are climbing. This is probably the epidemic of our time, autoimmune disease. Know that it's the #1 cause of death in women under the age of 65. So women, pay attention. If you're under 65, autoimmune disease is the top killer for you. So let's dive into tonight. I really want to talk about the #1 factor this is my experience, the #1 factor that actually leads to autoimmune disease or contributes to autoimmune disease. And actually, before I answer this, I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to answer this question. So any of you who can chime in with the right answer, the first person that chimes in with the right answer, we're going to get a free copy of my best-selling book, No Grain, No Pain. So go ahead. I'm going to open it up. What's the #1 factor in the development of autoimmune disease in the United States? What is the #1 component or the #1 contributing element to autoimmunity? We're going to take just a few seconds to let the answers roll in. Alan, let me know when we've got somebody with a correct answer or with answers. I don't have my screen up tonight in front of me, so actually maybe what I can do is pull that up. Okay, let's see here. I'm getting lots of different answers. I'm getting leaky gut, poor diet. Get a couple of you chiming in with the right answer. We got gut, we got grains, we got diet, we got wheat, we got eating wrong. Lots of good answers. None of them are wrong. But the number one, and again, what I told you was the number one in my experience, not necessarily the number one statistically speaking, but the number one in my experience, which is 20 years in a clinic. So it's pretty vast in that regard. I want to make sure, let's see, those answers are correct, and they came in at 6:08, but I wanted to see if we got anybody on our other channel. So we got 2 channels tonight, guys. Be patient with me. Okay. So it looks like we got a big winner here on our YouTube channel. So if you're on Facebook, looks like our YouTube channel answered quickest. And let's pull it up and I'll announce the winner here. It looks like we got Larita Hollingsworth. Larita, if you will get with Laura, Laura, and you can contact Laura, glutenology@gmail.com, and just let her know that you answered the question on Monday night live with Dr. Osborne on Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. The answer is gluten. Number one factor in my experience in developing autoimmune disease is gluten. And tonight I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why and kind of what some of the research actually says, because I can give you anecdote all night. I mean, I've had thousands and thousands of people come through my clinic with autoimmune conditions go into remission, and one of the biggest elements of change that we implement is a gluten-free diet. Of course, we do this through testing, and if you don't know what that means, a lot of you may have been tested for celiac disease. Know that gluten sensitivity and celiac disease are not the same thing. Some people have celiac disease, and all of those people have a gluten sensitivity, but not everybody with a gluten sensitivity will go on to develop celiac disease. Many of those individuals will develop other forms of autoimmunity, and there are a lot of different forms of autoimmunity. To date, it's arguable, but somewhere between 80 and 100 plus forms of autoimmune disease have been recognized in medical research. And gluten, there's so many research studies showing that gluten is really at the heart of a lot of these different forms of autoimmunity. And in my experience, where do we see gluten play a big role? One of the biggest is in inflammatory bowel disease. We'll see a lot of people with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. Note also that celiac disease is an inflammatory bowel disease, but if you've been diagnosed with Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, there are other forms of colitis that are also autoimmune disease, like mucilaginous colitis. Look, you better get yourself checked for gluten sensitivity. I know what your doctor will say. Your doctor will say that diet has really very little to do with the development of autoimmune disease, and that is just not true. The doctors generally, why do they say that? Because they have less than 7 hours of nutritional training when they go to medical school. So the only training they really get is the opposite of nutritional training. They get told how unimportant nutrition is in most of the hours that they're taught in medical school. So of course they're going to dismiss it. Of course they're going to say it has nothing to do with it. I would ask all of you, and if you've had this experience, please share it so that other people watching tonight can kind of validate it or be validated. And that is, how many of you have gone to the doctor and been told diet didn't have anything to do with autoimmune disease? If you've been to the doctor and that's true, type in or type in yes, no diet. Yes, no diet means that your doctor said that the diet did not have anything to do with the development of autoimmune disease. Now, that being said, if you look at what causes or what triggers autoimmunity, a lot of doctors will tell you, we don't know. Like, the general answer is, if you get a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis or Hashimoto's hypothyroid or scleroderma or dermatomyositis or ankylosing spondylitis or psoriasis or vitiligo or eczema or osteoporosis, a lot of times, and these are all forms of autoimmunity, the doctor will tell you, look, we don't know what causes it, but we have this pill that can fix it, right? Does that make sense? First of all, I want you to think about how that one statement right there doesn't even add up. We don't know what causes it, but we know that if you don't take this pill, you're going to be crippled for the rest of your life, or if you don't take this pill, you're somehow never going to recover. If they don't know gluten-free has this miraculous, all of a sudden they don't have autoimmune disease anymore. This is a first step, but it's a huge first step because for many, gluten induces autoimmune disease, and for many, gluten causes other problems that contribute to autoimmune disease. So you've got direct causal relationships, but then you have indirect components of how gluten can damage the body. Gluten can cause leaky gut, gluten can cause malabsorption and vitamin and mineral deficiency. Gluten can directly cause an autoimmune disease. So depending on which autoimmune disease you've been diagnosed with, you should understand that the very first thing that you should ask your doctor to do is to check you for genetically. Now, don't do a celiac disease test, and if you aren't familiar with the difference, go back and watch my archives. I've talked about this in great depth, the difference between the lab testing for gluten sensitivity and celiac disease, but you need to get genetically tested. Now, if your doctor's not willing to genetically test you, let's see if we can get Alan to put up a link below the video here that for genetic testing for gluten sensitivity. So if you have a doctor who's not willing to do it, or they're just fighting you tooth and nail and they're telling you that gluten has nothing to do with autoimmune, autoimmune asthma are definitely caused by gluten. The original name, one of the early names for asthma, came from what we knew about bakers. Bakers' asthma. Bakers, because they played with a lot of flour and dough, throwing that up into the air, and it was aerosolized and was breathed into the lungs, and so it created an asthmatic reaction in their airway, and that was called baker's asthma. So one of the oldest known forms of asthma is actually induced by wheat flour in bakers. And so a lot of kids today, what is their staple food? They wake up, they have cereal, they go to school and they have lunch, it's a sandwich or some type of pasta or pizza or some type of hamburger, right, with the buns. And then at dinner time, it's some kind of pasta or some kind of pizza, right? So we look at the staple of what most kids in industrialized countries are eating today, and predominantly it's grain. And many kids struggle with asthma. As a matter of fact, asthma is on an epic rise right now. I'll show you a diagram in a minute from 1950 to today, how autoimmune disease just continues to increase and increase. But if you've got a diagnosis of asthma, definitely know that gluten is a major, major contributor to it. Another one is hypothyroidism. And a few years ago, last time I checked, hypothyroid was kind of back and forth between the number 1 and the number 2 prescription medication being used in the U.S., meaning it was such a common, such a prolific problem that many people were being put on the medication. But this has also been very well established that gluten-free diets can actually reduce thyroid antibodies quite dramatically. I've seen cases where people had thyroid antibodies well over 6,000, multiple thousand, in the multiple thousands, and normalize those antibodies with a gluten-free diet, meaning no other changes, just going on a gluten-free diet. And when I say gluten-free, let's delineate what I mean by that. A true gluten-free diet, not a gluten-free diet where you go visit the grocery store shelves and you pull all the gluten-free pasta and the gluten-free bread products and the gluten-free chips and crackers and snacks and start eating those instead. No, those unhealthy garbage foods aren't going to help you recover from poor health. So don't go to the gluten-free aisle and try to substitute everything out, or you'll be poorly disappointed in the gluten-free diet effect. As a matter of fact, many people come to my clinic, and one of the biggest things that I hear is that, oh, I've already been on that gluten-free diet, it really didn't work for me. And when we started asking about what kind of gluten-free diet they were actually following, it was gluten-free processed, gluten-free packaged foods that weren't really even gluten-free. You know, the cornbreads, the corn and the rice mixtures, the rice bread mixtures, the pancake stuff, you know, all the waffles and stuff like that. So, you know, again, a lot of those processed foods don't help you, so I wouldn't recommend that. But back to this, hypothyroidism, very, very common, and gluten is a big factor in that. Another one is a skin disorder, eczema, and I've seen eczema be caused for a number of different reasons, but gluten is a big one. Gluten, in many cases, eczema can clear up just going on a gluten-free diet. So eczema is a form of autoimmune process of autoimmune disease in the skin. We've also got other conditions in kids. So if you look at these two, a lot of asthma, a lot of eczema, really found in kids, especially kids that are breastfed or that are not breastfed, but that are formula fed. If you look at some of the ingredients in the formula, in baby formula, I did a whole show on this one time. But, you know, generally speaking, the number 2, number 3, number 4 ingredient in a lot of your formulas that kids are being fed is genetically modified corn sugar and GMO soy and then just pure sugar. So, you know, when you're looking at those things, it's no wonder we have so many different babies that are developing eczema. Another skin condition is psoriasis. Psoriasis is very common. And on another note, so there's psoriasis, but then there's also psoriatic arthritis, or we'll just abbreviate that as PA, psoriatic arthritis. So if you've ever been diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis or psoriasis, know that that's one that gluten can also contribute to as well. If you've got a child, or if you are somebody who's ever been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, know that going gluten-free is one of the kind of cardinal rules of diet adjustment. Predominantly because we know gluten as a impact can act like a neurotoxin and can affect the blood-brain barrier and can affect the way that you think, right? It can affect the way that you produce neurotransmitters. Gluten can also alter the microbiome. It can alter the types of bacteria that live in your gut. Remember, 90% of your serotonin comes from your gut bugs, comes from your good bacteria that live in your gut. About 60% of your dopamine come from your good, healthy gut bugs. Eating gluten can disrupt those bugs and therefore disrupt your body's capacity to adequately produce neurotransmitters to allow for accurate thought and to allow for proper attention. So it's not just ADD and ADHD as neurological disorders, because there are also other neurological disorders that gluten can cause. Neuropathy, migraine headache is linked to gluten exposure as well. Additionally, beyond those things, schizophrenia's original name was bread madness. So we know that schizophrenia, if we analyze schizophrenics, many of them have positive antibodies for gluten exposure, and when they go on a gluten-free diet, their symptoms can dramatically improve. Again, I want to be very clear to all of you watching tonight. What I'm not saying is that everyone with asthma, everyone with schizophrenia, everyone with psoriasis, that I'm not saying that all of these people strictly have these diseases only because of gluten. What I'm trying to share with you is gluten is a big impact factor. For many forms of autoimmune disease, taking gluten out of the diet, we see dramatic improvements in these different forms of autoimmune disease. So I want to be clear, I'm not promoting gluten-free diets as a cure-all to everything. It's much more complicated than that, because autoimmune disease definitely has more triggers than simply one food-based protein like gluten. There certainly are other triggers. Other foods can be triggers. Microbial imbalances, yeast overgrowth, bacterial infection, parasitic infection can all cause autoimmune disease or be a trigger for autoimmune disease. Nutritional deficiency like vitamin D deficiency, zinc deficiency can be triggers for autoimmune disease. So we've got multiple different triggers for autoimmune disease. It's just that gluten, pound for pound, has some of the biggest impact on autoimmune symptoms and autoimmune disease. And so if we could only make one change, it would be the change that I would recommend that you make. Now, beyond these different conditions, are there other conditions? Yeah, did we get that image up, Alan? I can't see my screen, so I don't know if that image ever came up. But I've got another image for you, and it's a much, much bigger list of conditions that have been, in research, in science, and studies. These are diseases that have been linked to gluten exposure, meaning you eat gluten and you can develop different types of disease. A lot of people think, well, I don't have celiac disease, so gluten's not a problem for me. And understand that gluten is not one thing. First of all, it's a family of proteins. There are about 1,000 different forms of gluten found in all different types of grains, and some people react in one way, some people react in another way. Think of it like a drug. If I gave 10,000 people a drug, would they all have the same side effects and reactions? And the answer is no. Well, it's like gluten. If I give 10,000 people with gluten sensitivity issues gluten, are they all going to develop the exact same disease and the exact same symptoms? And the answer is no, because those individuals are as unique as they are. And so they're going to develop a plethora or an array of different symptoms, and it's going to be a spectrum, right? And so we look at these as the spectrum of gluten-related diseases or the spectrum of gluten-related disorders. And it's important that you understand it's a spectrum because, again, the argument that a lot of people are going to give you is you don't have celiac disease, therefore you should eat more gluten because going gluten-free is somehow dangerous. First of all, let's dispel that myth. Going gluten-free is not dangerous. It doesn't cause malnutrition. There's no danger in going on a gluten-free diet. The biggest danger in gluten-free diets is what I said earlier. If you go to the gluten-free aisle in most grocery stores and just replace, your wheat bread with your rice bread, etc., if you replace one with the other, what you're really doing is you're trading out processed food products. You're trading out unhealthy things with other unhealthy things, and that's not really going to help you recover or heal or repair yourself. So, again, the number one factor in the development of autoimmune disease, if I could wave a magic wand and say, if we want to make most of autoimmune disease dramatically improve or dramatically diminish in this country, we would wave that magic wand and we would take gluten away as the staple food in the diet of the mainstream industrialized countries. And we would see nothing short of miraculous change. If the rest of the country is a macrocosm of what I've seen in my practice, then we honestly would see miracles happening in the autoimmune spectrum of diseases. So again, if you've been diagnosed with autoimmunity, number one thing that you can do to improve that is just really to go gluten-free. Okay, let's see here. I want to put up another image for you guys, and this one is more of a chart. So we get that chart up, Alan. I put together. This is actually coming out of a study that was done a few years ago. I think it was New England Journal of Medicine that published this. But this is a diagram on autoimmune prevalence and how it's been increasing. So if you look at this diagram, just let me know once you have it up, Alan. Okay, if you look at it, there are a number of different diseases, and most of them, it's not every autoimmune disease, but it's a select handful of autoimmune disease. Irritable bowel, or not irritable bowel, but inflammatory bowel disease and asthma are a couple of them. But if you look at the incidence, how they've increased over the years, they're increasing dramatically since 1950. So part of what we have to do is we have to ask the fundamental question, why are these autoimmune diseases, just dramatically increasing? Like, what is the progenesis of that increase? And so, like, you look at Crohn's disease, you look at multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes and asthma, and even celiac disease, like in Canada. I can't remember the last study I saw in Canada, but in Canada, the incidence of celiac disease has increased. I want to say it was like 30% increase in the last 20 or 30 years. So what's causing this? A lot of people say, well, Dr. Osborne, gluten's been around a lot longer than since the 1950s, right? Isn't bread the staple of life? Isn't bread, what Jesus said to eat? First of all, we've got a lot more gluten. Some argue that we have 7 to 10 times more gluten in the staple diet of the average industrialized country than we used to have. So part of this is not that gluten didn't cause problems before, it's that we're seeing a rapid rise in a lot of these autoimmune conditions that we know gluten can cause or contribute to because there's more gluten in the diet, in the day-to-day staple food that people are consuming. So a lot of people, again, going back to what I talked about earlier, it's cereal for breakfast, it's sandwiches for lunch, it's pizza for dinner. Most people, 70% of their daily caloric intake is coming largely from grain-based staples. If you look at the food guide pyramid, even the food guide pyramid, largely recommends whole grains as the primary source of caloric intake, even though the food guide pyramid was not written by a nutritionist, it was written by attorneys and politicians who want you to eat more grain. So it's important that you understand that part of the reason we see that massive rise is we see a massive increase in gluten consumption as a whole. Again, there are other triggers as well. One of the other trigger factors, and I might make a lot of you mad, and some of you you might start clapping, and this is not an argument tonight. This is not a debate about vaccines, but the reality is is, since our first vaccine in 1943, again, if you look at that graph from 1950 up, we see this spiraling increase. And many of the adjuvants in vaccines, the aluminum, the mercury, the egg-based ingredients, many are allergic to egg and don't even realize that many of the vaccine ingredients contain egg. But we've got chemical adjuvants in vaccines that we absolutely know beyond the shadow of a doubt can for some cause or contribute to autoimmune disease. There are textbooks, medical textbooks written on this topic. As a matter of fact, I just got back from New York almost a year, it was about 10 months ago, where I was presenting with one of the world leading experts on this topic, Dr. Yehuda Schoenfeld, and he wrote the textbook on how vaccines can contribute to many forms of autoimmune disease. For example, the flu shot can cause a neurological form of autoimmunity called Guillain-Barre syndrome. But then we have other forms of vaccines that we know can contribute to other forms of neurological autoimmunity, as well as things like lupus. Many of the medications that people are on can also contribute to autoimmunity. Did you know, for example, one of the primary ways that autoimmune disease is treated is with steroids? A lot of doctors will prescribe steroids to block the inflammation of autoimmunity. But did you know that steroids can actually cause lupus, which is another form of autoimmune disease? So a lot of people aren't aware. Women, if you are post-breast cancer and maybe you've had the surgery and now maybe your doctor has you on an aromatase inhibitor, did you know that those aromatase inhibitors can actually cause autoimmune disease? Did you know that certain high blood pressure medications can actually cause autoimmune disease? So there are a number of different classes of medications that are actually, they serve as triggers for autoimmune disease. And if we're looking at the 4 triggers, I mentioned gluten before as the number 1, but gluten is in food, right? So food being one of the triggers, chemical exposure being another trigger. Chemicals, this could be in things like vaccines, but it can also be food additives, food preservatives. It can be pollution in the air, in the water, etc. These chemicals, we're being exposed to about 30,000 chemicals today versus 1950. So big change in chemical exposure. Then we also have microbial imbalances. This is, if you want to, some people will call this infection. I don't like to use the word infection. Infection implies that all bacteria are bad and it creates germophobia, and I don't believe in that. But microbial imbalance, meaning certain bacteria, certain viruses, certain types of microorganisms can contribute or be a trigger for autoimmunity. And then the 4th predominant trigger for autoimmunity is nutritional deficit. So nutrient deficiency, like vitamin D, for example, we know that vitamin D deficiency can directly cause rheumatoid arthritis. So nutrient deficiency is a trigger. Now, some would say, well, what about stress? Yeah, we can add stress to this list. Stress, in my experience, again, my experience is that stress is typically not the cause of autoimmune disease. Stress is the tipping point. So a lot of people are here going along doing these things all wrong, and then a big stress hits them in their life, and the stress gets the blame because the stress was the tipping point that activated the disease. But in reality, these 4 things right here, the food, the chemical exposure, the microbiome, the nutritional deficit, those are the pillars of your good health. And if you're not taking care of these things, your pillars become weak, so that anytime a big bolus of stress comes along, it can knock you off your feet. And that's when autoimmune disease can begin. That's when the process can actually start. So it's important that you understand this. Tonight I wanted to give you a little bit more in terms of gluten-related autoimmune disease, because the question comes up so frequently, hey, does gluten have anything to do with vitiligo? Does gluten have anything to do with hypothyroidism? Does gluten have anything to do with inflammatory bowel disease? Does gluten have anything to do with type 1 diabetes? And the answer is yes, it does. If it's autoimmune disease, does gluten have something to do with it? Yes, it does, and it can. That doesn't mean it'll cure your autoimmune disease, but you should start the process of ruling in or out whether or not you have gluten sensitivity. And if you're not doing that and you do have a diagnosis of autoimmune disease, I can just tell you what my experience is. My experience is you'll never recover from that autoimmune disease, and you'll always be a proverbial slave to the medicine. You'll always be kind of shackled to mitigating the symptoms by taking more and more medicines. And the problem with doing that is the more medicine you take over time, the more you run the risk of developing other autoimmune diseases, because the predominant drug that's used to treat autoimmunity, number 1, is the steroid, which we know can also cause autoimmune disease. So that makes zero sense that would be a main focal point of what doctors would choose to use to treat it. But number two, a lot of autoimmune diseases are now being treated with a new class of medication, the biologics. These are immune suppressing drugs, the tumor necrosis factor alpha inhibitors. Those medications, long-term for many people, create cancer. So now you're saying, okay, I'm going to treat my autoimmune disease until I get cancer or until the side effects of the drug catch up with me. And it's just not a path that I encourage anybody to have to go down, because autoimmune disease is reversible. That's the opposite of what you're going to hear. A lot of people will tell you, no, autoimmune disease is not reversible, because the first words out of most doctors' mouths is, we don't know what causes it. Let me tell you about my history and how I actually came to understand these things. When I was in the rheumatology department at the VA hospital, I was an intern, and I was there to study, and one of the things that I saw was person after person being put on very, very powerful cancer medications like methotrexate, very, very powerful steroids, very, very powerful non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and these people weren't getting better. They weren't really feeling better, and their body condition was not improving. And many of them, after years of being medicated, were then having their joints replaced. The doctors were then going in and saying, oh, well, medicine's no longer working, let's replace the joint now that the joint is destroyed. And so these people would be on medications for a number of years. And, you know, remember, these medicines don't come without side effects, and they don't come without a cost. So here you are paying this cost, and the medication deteriorates your health at the price of allowing you to have some pain relief. But at the end of the day, when you have to have surgery and your nutrition is destroyed and your health is destroyed, how well do you think these people recover from their surgeries? They always recovered, in my experience when I was there, they always recovered very poorly. The outcomes were bad. And it's one of the reasons why I was so frustrated with the hospital system there. Now, that being said, one of the books I was given to study as an intern was a book called The Primer, or The Primer on Rheumatological Disease. Now, rheumatological disease, those are just autoimmune diseases that affect the muscles, the joints, and the bones. So when you talk about rheumatology, there's things like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis. So these, again, are largely musculoskeletal autoimmune diseases. And so as I was being exposed to this primer, this was supposed to be the Bible. Like, this is the book that we were supposed to learn, and we were supposed to learn from it. And so as I was reading it, because I'm a student, as I was reading it, what I found was in every case of autoimmune disease, I found that there were these relationships in the section on what causes these diseases. So in the books, it was always like, you know, there's not one cause for autoimmune disease, but it's multifactorial, right? And there's a genetic component, which is why I recommend you get tested genetically for gluten, because it's one of the genetic components. It's called an HLA-DQ genotype, and it's one of the genes responsible for the development of autoimmune disease. But then there were also, in the primer, in this very book, there were, you know, this bacterial infection can cause autoimmune disease. This virus can trigger autoimmune disease. So what I was saying is microbial imbalances were triggers. I was seeing that chemical exposures were triggers. I was seeing that food was a trigger, and a big part of my research was fasting and autoimmunity, so how not eating could actually lead to the remission of pain within as little as 48 hours for somebody with acute flares and autoimmune pain. And so as I was reading and learning about all this information, I was excited. As a young student, I was excited because I thought I would be able to apply that information. I thought I'd be able to take that information to my attending physician and say, hey, look here, this is it. And all I was told to read the book, and when I read the book and I said, here's the information, we need to apply it, I was told, no, we're not going to apply it. Nobody ever wanted to apply what was in the book that was written by the experts, and that was ultimately so frustrating for me. And I know many of you out there that are watching this show tonight, you're probably just as frustrated, because if you have an autoimmune condition and you went to a rheumatologist or an endocrinologist or another expert or specialist in autoimmunity, and you were told that diet has nothing to do with it, know that this is what the primer on the diseases says, that food is a trigger, that chemical exposures are a trigger, that microbial imbalances are triggers, and nutrient deficit is a trigger. So if those things are triggers, and autoimmune disease is not caused by one thing, but it's caused by multifactorial issues, shouldn't we begin the process of understanding autoimmune disease by ruling out the different types of triggers? It only made sense to me, but it wasn't anything that anybody let me do when I was in the VA hospital. And that's one of the big reasons why I had to leave that environment to start my own private practice, was to be able to apply this, because it made sense to me. On day one of application, we were saving lives, because one of my very first patients that came in to see me was a little girl with terminal juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And she had 6 months to live. She developed the disease at 2 years of age. She'd been medicated for 7 years. She was 9 years old when her mom brought her in to see me. And they told her, there's nothing more we can do for your daughter. She's got about 6 months. You need to prepare for, her passing. And that's where they were. And the number one factor that changed that little girl's life and saved her life was identifying gluten sensitivity genetically and applying a gluten-free diet. Now, did she have other food triggers? Did she have other chemical triggers? Did she have nutritional deficit triggers? Yes, she did. And did we identify those? Yes, because that's what you do for autoimmunity. You identify the fundamental categorical triggers as the primary agent of change, because autoimmune disease, believe it or not, is a disease of lifestyle choice. It is a disease that is accumulated of triggers that you have control to choose over. You can choose what you want to do in this area, in this neighborhood, and that to me is wonderful because it empowers you to make change. You just have to have the roadmap to be able to make that change. So if you're struggling with autoimmune disease and you're visiting with a doctor and they're not talking about the triggers of autoimmune disease, you either have one or two options. You can leave that doctor and find a doctor who actually looks at these things, or you can choose to stay with that doctor knowing that the medicines that you're going to be on don't come without a cost, and you're going to pay the long-term cost of disease progression with that medication. Or maybe you'll have a miraculous spontaneous recovery. I don't know. I can't predict the future, but I can tell you that's my experience. That when people when they're told that this has nothing to do with their condition and that medicine's the only solution, they generally never get better and their outcomes are poor. And when people understand this, their outcomes are generally fantastic and they can take control back over their health. And that's what I wish for every one of you watching the show tonight, is that if you are struggling with an autoimmune condition, that you come to the realization that these things can be objectified, they can be measured, and they can be changed. All you have to do is have the strength and the will to start moving in that direction and looking at these things versus looking at how you can suppress your symptoms with very, very powerful medications that can have very untoward side effects. So that being said, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. So if you've got questions, go ahead and start typing them in. Oh, I love that. Bobby said, yes, absolutely true. If you've had an autoimmune disease and you've had it reversed by applying these fundamentals, share that with the feed. Type in yes, I've recovered from autoimmune disease doing this. Put in a message that lets other people know that you've recovered as a result of making those changes. Oh, Lee, I mentioned Lee Shepard wants to know which hypertension medicines can cause problems. The class of medications from blood pressure perspective are called ARBs, angiotensin receptor blockers. And so those are, like losartan would be an example of that class of medication. If it ends in artan, A-R-T-A-N, it's an ARB, and those medications can actually cause celiac disease. Okay. Let's see, I'm pretty sure I've got celiac, trying to find a competent doctor in Houston. Kelly, give my office a call. Alan, I don't know if you can just throw the link up to our office and get Kelly directed in the right direction.
YouTube or Facebook?
drpeterosborne.com. YouTube. Yeah, sorry. Susan says, so by being gluten-free, can I reverse my psoriatic arthritis and psoriasis? I've been gluten-free since the beginning of this year and still suffer. So again, as I said earlier, don't think of this as a cure-all. It is more complicated than that for many people. But this right here, this formulaic investigation, yes, can you reverse psoriatic arthritis and psoriasis? I've seen it happen, so I will say yes. Let's see. You wants to know, what about Raynaud's phenomena, or Raynaud's syndrome? Yes, it's an autoimmune condition. Again, go back to what I said at the beginning of the show. If you have an autoimmune disease, the number one factor, I don't care what autoimmune disease you have. Let me give you an example. There's a very rare form of autoimmunity called erythromelalgia. Okay? When I had a case come into my office, there were only 12 reported cases in the entire world. This is how rare this form of autoimmune disease is. And it's a disease, it's an autoimmune attack against the valves of the veins, so that what happens when people try to walk, the blood pools to the bottom of the feet and they can only walk a few hundred steps before having to sit back down. It's very crippling. And so in this case, we got a woman who had this very, very rare disease. One of the things we did is we took her gluten-free. And what did we do? We got her from walking 100 feet to walking about a half a mile. So it didn't reverse fully her disease. Her damage was there far too long before she got to me. But we got her walking half a mile just by making a gluten-free change. My point being is it doesn't matter, the name of the autoimmune disease that you've been given is a name, right? And people give power to names. Understand that autoimmune disease has all of them, no matter what your diagnosis is, they all have the same underlying origin of reasons why they exist. These are the summary triggers for autoimmunity, and that's why you have to look at those things. If you don't look at those things, you're going to struggle. If you look at those things, it doesn't matter what diagnosis you were given. I can't tell you how many people I've seen. By the time they get to me, look, I've got people that have come to me from all over the world. They've been to Mayo, they've been to Cleveland, they've been to the best clinics in the world. They've had different doctors looking at them telling you, no, I think you have lupus. Another one will say, no, it looks like more like reactive arthritis. Another one will say, no, more like rheumatoid arthritis. Like, it's all opinions, right? It's basically all opinions based on the symptoms that people are having. It's not a super objective way to come about a diagnosis. So my point in saying all that is the name of the autoimmune disease is less important than the fact that you have an autoimmune process. And if you want to stop an autoimmune process, you evaluate where the autoimmune process is beginning. And these are the triggers. So it doesn't matter what your diagnosis is. If you go after the triggers, you go after the underlying reason, and the name of the disease becomes less important. I can't emphasize that enough, because I've seen so many people are like, well, what about this disease? And what about that disease? And what about this disease? Is it autoimmune? Then the answer is yes. Number one factor. Okay. So again, the question, no, I just answered that because many of you are asking, what about mastocytosis? What about histamine issues? What about mast cell disease? Yes, 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 all forms of autoimmunity. What about thrombocytopenia purpura, or TPP? Yes, the answer is yes. Okay, myasthenia gravis. Myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disease, and yes, Graves' disease is also an autoimmune disease. They're not the same thing, but yes. I had a case of somebody came in with myasthenia gravis a couple of years ago. No medicines, completely in remission. Let's see here. Love that a lot of you are having conversations in the feed, and I like that, sharing with each other your success and your stories of benefit of just diet and lifestyle change. It's fantastic to see that sharing. Okay. So Kelly says, I'm using digestive enzymes due to low stomach acid. How else can I encourage the return of the acid's natural production? Great question. So many people with autoimmune gastritis have low stomach acid production, and this is a very much of a can be a gluten issue. I see gastritis associated with gluten sensitivity on a very, very regular basis, and a lot of people, just by removing gluten from the diet, get some return or some healing in their stomach, and the gastritis goes away. And that's confirmed a lot of time through endoscopy. I'll send them back to their GI doctor and have them, reevaluate just to make sure that it's going away and that it's recovering. But that's one way. Another thing is if you're still struggling and you're still kind of working your way through these steps, then one of the things is that digestive enzymes is not going to improve your stomach acid. You got to take acid. So a betaine hydrochloride. I actually have a special gluten-free formulation of it called Ultra Acid that you can check out at glutenfreesociety.org if you're looking for an acid supplemental. Now, some people will also take apple cider vinegar, a teaspoon to as much as a couple of tablespoons 10 minutes before a meal, and that in and of itself is a mild acid that can help improve your digestion and support your digestion. Let's see. Alla wants to know, what's the best and fastest way to balance microbial balance and fix a leaky gut? I am gluten, milk, sugar-free, but don't see much of the improvement. I'm also taking immunity pills. The best way is to know what's causing it. If you want to fix a microbial imbalance and you want to fix a leaky gut, you've got to know what the triggers are. You can go dairy-free, sugar-free, gluten-free, but if those are half the triggers and you still have another body of triggers that are over here that aren't being addressed, you're not going to be super successful. For example, I've seen cases where people were allergic to blueberries and broccoli and cauliflower, some of the best, healthiest foods that you could otherwise eat. But in these individuals, they were reacting to them. So as part of what they were eating, thinking they were eating healthy, but what they were eating was contributing to gut damage, that's part of it. The other thing is, many of you that are maybe struggling or maybe you've taken several rounds of antibiotics. Maybe you've taken medicines like antacids and other medicines that actually damage the gut, like non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. And so those are triggers as well. So you've really got to get comprehensive with it. You can't just go gluten and dairy free and always recover. Now, some people do. I see some people go gluten, dairy, sugar free and recover fully. And I see others that it's because they have too many other triggers that they haven't addressed that are also contributing to it. But in that regard, that hopefully that helps you at least. Hale wants to know if I think the specific carbohydrate diet is a better guideline than keto or low carb diets because it might help balance the gut bacteria. No one diet is exactly right for everyone. So whether you're determining to go on a specific carbohydrate or a keto or a carnivore or a gluten-free keto, GLETO diet, it boils back down to knowing what's right for you as a unique person. Because let's say you're on the specific carbohydrate diet, or let's say you're on a keto diet, like a carnivore diet, and you're allergic to chicken, and you're over there pounding chicken. And the allergy is not an acute anaphylactic reaction where your lips are swelling, but it's a delayed hypersensitivity reaction where it's just creating chronic low-grade inflammation. Like, that's a possibility. So the diet itself and the change of the diet should be analyzed well enough to be unique to the person, and then using generalized rules like the specific carbohydrate or the true gluten-free diet or the keto diet or the carnivore diet. Like, those specific rules are generalizations, but you've got to get specificity to the individual needing to make the diet change. Otherwise, you struggle. Otherwise, you try a diet, and when it doesn't work, you try another diet. And when it doesn't work, you try another one. And then you get frustrated because I don't know anyone in the world that likes to work and make major changes and work really hard at making major changes, but not yield a reward for putting in that hard work. I mean, if any of you are out there that like to work for not getting reward, call me. We've got some jobs that we need done. But most people, when they make these big changes, they expect to see an impact, an improvement in their health, and it's when they don't that they get frustrated and quit. What I'm saying is, don't do it generalized. Do it with specificity. If you do it with specificity, it cuts down, it shaves down on the time that it takes you to recover. It cuts down and shaves down on the frustration that you might have for a lack of response. I see it all the time. People trying this diet, trying that diet, and when it doesn't work for them, kind of sometimes they get hopeless, and that's the worst place to be when you're sick. Can iron deficiency anemia be an autoimmune disease? It can be, Rita. There's actually something, it happens for celiacs. It's called refractory celiac. It's when a person with a gluten issue doesn't get better taking gluten out of their diet, and that gluten damages the area of the stomach and small intestine that creates an iron loss, because iron is absorbed by having adequate stomach acid, but it's also absorbed by the distal small intestine. That's where it goes into the bloodstream. And so if those two areas are damaged, you can become iron deficient as a result of an autoimmune process that's damaging the intestines. It's very, very common to see that. And it's called refractory disease. And in some cases, some doctors, there's another type of refractory. It's called refractory iron deficiency anemia. It's where you supplement with iron, but you still don't see the iron levels or the ferritin levels really start to come up. Susan wants to know, how would they test for chemical microbial imbalances, etc.? It's not one test, Susan. It's a battery of different types of tests that need to be done. And if they can't tell you, I need to do this on you, then they don't know. And that's what I mean. Like, find a doctor that's qualified to be able to look at these things. Don't find a doctor who's not qualified and ask them to figure it out. That's just my advice, because it'd be kind of like going to an airplane mechanic and saying, I know you fix airplanes, but could you also fix my car? Even though they're not the same type of motor, there are similarities, but not quite the same. You don't want to spend your time in that regard. Let's see. Not quite sure I understand what you're asking, Juan. What's the time and place for meds and vaccinations? Is there a time and place? Yeah, there can be. But the time and place is not first-line therapy. Like you don't, if you've got a problem, you don't take a medicine, because medicine deficiency it's not the cause of your problem. Like medicine is designed really, where originally where medicines were brought in was when people were in such a bad state that they needed the medicine almost like a crutch to kind of pull them back. Or if there was a life-threatening infection, like a bacterial infection that would kill you, right, if you didn't take an antibiotic. Like those are times and places where, medicine is definitely an important science. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But when it comes to chronic autoimmune disease, again, this is an area where medicine, in my experience and in my opinion, has completely failed the end user or the end consumer, because it doesn't solve their problem, but it creates new problems for them that then lead to new medications to treat the problems that the medicines originally caused, and it becomes a vicious cycle. But is there a place and a time for medicine? Sure there is. You just, you've got to be the good steward of your own body. And if you're not doing what you're supposed to do, there's 7 habits. There's what I call the 7 highly effective habits of the gluten-free warrior. And these are lifestyle habits that you should have. You should get sunshine. You should get adequate rest. You should eat healthy food. You should manage your stress appropriately. You should breathe clean air. You should drink clean water, and you should exercise. Like those are fundamental things. And I don't know if I threw in sleep, but you should be getting adequate sleep. Like those are fundamental habits. If you're not doing your part, don't expect the medicine to do your part for you, because it won't. It'll mitigate symptoms in your body. It might improve your quality of life over a short distance of time, but you'll pay a price on the tail end if you fail to take real action on improving your health. And that's what most doctors will never tell you. They'll tell you need to be on the medicine, that you're just getting older. They'll take away all your capacity at getting educated. They'll take away all your hope at any change, and they'll tell you that nothing you can do will even make a difference or matter. And that if you've got that kind of doctor, look, now make your own decision, but if I had that kind of doctor, I tell you what I would do. I'd run the other direction. Nobody's going to take away my hope, and nobody's going to tell me that I can't get better. I was born to be healthy and vibrant, and not to be a sick, drug-dependent person. And again, just go back and look at the diagram I showed you earlier on autoimmune disease. How many autoimmune diseases really existed prior to the 1950s? So if all of these are new kind of occurrences, we have to look at what's new in the human environment. This right here, the vast majority of it is new. So, okay. Yeah, so Chris says, what about perioral dermatitis and rosacea caused by using steroid cream for too long? Our 2-year-old needs help. The reality there, Chris, is, if you've got a kid that's on a steroid cream, there's going to be a withdrawal. And actually, there's a whole process behind steroid withdrawal, because a lot of people who've been on steroids chronically will actually develop worsening symptoms when they try to wean down off the steroid. We can put up a story that might be it might be helpful for you. I don't know if Alan, if you can pull up. We've got a video on Shanna. She had a severe steroid withdrawal issue, and her story is amazing because her face is so swollen and so inflamed at a certain point, and it took some time, and it took some effort, and it took some really close monitoring, but she was able to get off of all those medications and really make a comeback. And now today she's in remission without that stuff all over her face. So it's possible to make that change. Again, Chris, I would encourage you to get some guidance. Okay. The relationship between alcoholism and gluten sensitivity. Well, there's a strong one. There's actually now some new research showing that people with gluten sensitivity have a higher risk of becoming alcoholics. There's also some research that shows that alcohol can create the same type of damage that gluten can create. So there's kind of a commingling between the two. If you look at where most alcohols are made from, they're made from grain, right? They're either grain-based spirits or things like beer, where you've got a fermented wheat, barley, or some other type of grain-based product that's being used. Okay, let's see here. All right. I love it. Catherine chimes in. She says, diagnosed with IBS, have been gluten-free for 30 years and feel great. Niece with Crohn's has been free of symptoms and feels fantastic. No meds for 5 years, all with diet. Love it. Thanks for sharing, Catherine. That's awesome. Okay, let's see. Could H. pylori be implicated in I'm going to assume you mean autoimmune hepatitis. You know, I'm not going to say that it can't be. I've never seen it be implicated in autoimmune hepatitis personally, George. But H. pylori, generally where I'll see an H. pylori problem is when somebody has severe gastritis or inflammation in their GI tract, and it's creating damage and boring a hole into the mucus lining of their gut. That generally is what I've seen with H. pylori, the ulcers, the low stomach acid, but not necessarily hepatitis. Now, with autoimmune hepatitis, what I have seen, and I've seen it reverse, I've seen people on their deathbeds reverse autoimmune hepatitis. We got a testimonial story we could share with that one too, Alan, if you want to. I don't know if you could find that one. It's a story on autoimmune recovery of autoimmune hepatitis. But yeah, generally gluten is a big factor, and gluten is actually, there's a lot of really good research on gluten-induced fatty liver disease or hepatitis. So again, going back to what I said earlier in the show, those of you that are frustrated and really struggling and really trying to find an answer, get tested for gluten sensitivity. And then if you are gluten sensitive, take the diet seriously. And what I mean by take the diet seriously is no cheating, not eating gluten on the weekends, not going out to restaurants every other night, because you're going to get cross-contamination. And 20 parts per million of gluten is enough to create an inflammatory response for as long as 2 months. So you're never going to see any real recovery or real healing repair if you're getting those low levels of exposure consistently enough over time to continue to allow for the inflammation to perpetuate. Like that, Paula says, was on prednisone, methotrexate, several different biologics, sometimes stacked meds, 3 months gluten-free, feeling so much better, off several meds, goal to be totally med-free. And yeah, you can do that. You can be totally med-free. I'm telling you, I've seen it so many times. Susan wants to know if I do Skype. We do video conferencing, so if you want to call and consult, just reach out to my office, Susan. I think we put a link in. That's on YouTube. We put a link in earlier that you could connect with my office. Cassandra, weaned slowly off antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, and achieved homeostasis nearly with grain-free, plant-based diet, and moved to country to work on balancing with life and my soul. Love it. Moved out to the country. I moved out to the country too, Cassandra. Love it out in the country. You might see some of my posts of my chickens. We got green eggs and blue eggs and brown eggs and white eggs. Anyway, love the country life. Let's see here. I think I got most of them answered. If I missed your question, send us an email at glutenology@gmail.com. We'll do our best to get you an answer. And even if it's not on a live show, we'll get you an answer, preferably maybe through a video link as well. June wants to know, can the thyroid regenerate? I've seen it happen. I've even seen cases where people had partial thyroidectomies where they had part of their thyroid removed and they were able to get full thyroid function again. Not in everyone, but it can happen. I have seen it. Lichen sclerosis, don't know that there's a question there. Carmencita, is lichen sclerosis what? No question. Jeanette wants to know, can a traditional gluten-free diet and celiac disease cause tendon and ligament deterioration? So if you're referring, Jeanette, to a traditional gluten-free diet in the sense of the definition that I discuss, meaning the opposite of a true gluten-free diet, can a traditional gluten-free diet that's packed with corn and rice and other grains and genetically modified foods and processed foods, can that cause tendon and ligament deterioration? Absolutely it can. You can read all about it in my book, No Grain, No Pain, which was written largely on the premise of teaching people how to actually change their diet in a meaningful way to really get results. Yeah, so Ulke says, I have celiac disease for 13 years and following my gluten-free diet very well. I was diagnosed 4 more autoimmune diseases this year. I want to know the reason why I keep developing more autoimmune diseases. It's tiring and annoying. I'd say it's life-threatening, even more than tiring and annoying. Ulke, read No Grain, No Pain. It's the best thing I can tell you, because if you're celiac and you're following the diet that most gastroenterologists recommend when people get a celiac diagnosis, you're not going to recover. You're not going to get better. Yes, lichen sclerosis is autoimmune. So to answer that question, it can also be a fungal infection, though. Susan, what do you think about getting in the sun if you have lupus? I think getting in the sun is a necessity. Now, that doesn't mean get out at the hottest time of the day and burn yourself. And remember, you have to also take into account if your doctor's got you on any medications that cause sunlight sensitivity, that you have to take that into account. But sunshine is a requirement for human life. And so if you're avoiding the sun just because you have a name of a diagnosis, in my opinion, that's a mistake. You've got to tailor your capacity to get some sunshine, even if that means covering your face and letting the rest of your body absorb the vitamin D. Am I familiar with postural orthostatic tachycardia? Yes, and gluten can contribute to that. I've seen cases of that go away with gluten-free diets. Okay, can a gluten-free help with Sjogren's? Yes, it can. Remember what I said earlier, Linda? Can a gluten-free diet help with fill-in-the-blank autoimmune disease? Fill in the blank. Put in the name of the autoimmune disease, and if the answer is that what you fill in the blank with is the autoimmune disease, then ask yourself, can a gluten-free diet help? The likelihood is very, very strong. Again, I'm not guaranteeing that a gluten-free diet is a cure-all for anyone's autoimmune disease, but what I'm sharing here with you tonight is the number one factor in contributing to autoimmune disease in my clinical experience. I've been in practice now, this is my 20th year, is gluten. Okay, and I would argue that I've seen probably more cases of autoimmune disease recover as a result of diet and lifestyle change than possibly anyone. I don't know for certain. I can't say that for absolute 100% certainty. But I've seen thousands and thousands of cases go into remission. And a big part of that's why I wrote No Grain, No Pain, was to teach people about gluten's relationship to autoimmunity and autoimmune pain. So if you've got an autoimmune condition and you have, like I said at the beginning, if you have not yet discerned whether or not you are gluten sensitive and need to be on an actual true gluten-free diet, so that's step one. Get confirmation of the diet change that you need to make, because you're never going to make it appropriately enough if you don't confirm that it's absolutely certain, beyond the shadow of a doubt, what you need to do. People will struggle with that. They will say, I tried gluten-free. They will try it a little while. Understand it can take 18 months plus to take an autoimmune disease from full flare to put it into remission. So you're not going to go on a gluten-free diet over the weekend or the week and recover. So you've got to have, number one, the idea of whether or not it's the right move for you to make. But number two, you've got to have realistic expectations, especially if you've been battling with autoimmunity for decades. You can't expect it to go away in a week or a month just because you changed your diet. And that's where having somebody that can guide you along the way might be extremely invaluable for you in that regard. Gluten and dementia, yes. Good question, Julie. Gluten and dementia. Alzheimer's now being called type 3 diabetes. Can gluten contribute to diabetes? Absolutely it can. What's the best way to reduce inflammation? How long does it take to rid it from the body? High CRP, actually 8.4 is not terribly high, but it is high. Joan, the best way to reduce inflammation is to find out where it's coming from and remove the source. There's no magic pill, there's no magic supplement, there's no magic thing that you should do. Because think about it like this. A lot of people will take turmeric, as an anti-inflammatory supplement instead of like ibuprofen or instead of a drug that blocks inflammation. Both people are wrong in that scenario, because if you don't know where the inflammation is coming from and you seek to mask it, whether you're masking it with a drug or whether you're masking it with something natural, you still haven't identified its origin. And as long as you don't identify the origin, that inflammation is just going to rear its ugly head in a different way. It's going to morph, it's going to change, it's going to expose symptoms in new ways every time you try to mask it. So find out why it's there. That's the best way to get rid of inflammation. Not to guess at it, not to take high doses of anything. It's to find out its origin. When you know what that is, you can be effective and your body can deal with the inflammation. As far as how long it takes to get the inflammation out of your body, look, your body is constantly healing. It heals all the time. It's breaking things down and it's repairing things every day, day in, day out. Your gut, for example, it's brand new every 2 days because it recovers and it heals itself every 2 days. But if you are doing something in your diet or in your lifestyle that's creating inflammation on a daily basis, you never give your body the opportunity to fully heal the inflammation. So the best way to get rid of it is to identify the source and quit chasing it with elixirs and potions and other things, because you're not going to find an answer in that. Now, that doesn't mean that things like turmeric can't be helpful. It just simply means it's not the solution in and of itself by itself. Okay. Any info about low-dose naltrexone? Look, long-term, low-dose naltrexone, long-term, there's no real great research that says it's dangerous, and it's been relatively tolerated relatively well. That being said, do you have a low-dose naltrexone deficiency? Is that why you have inflammation? So again, going back to what I just said, a lot of people opt to do LDN, low-dose naltrexone. It's a medication, for those of you that don't know. And look, the reality is it still doesn't solve your problem. It solves your symptoms. And if you really want to solve your problems, you can't take something that masks what they are. It's kind of like in a relationship, right? If you fundamentally, let's say that you're a Jewish person and fundamentally you believe in that you should be with another Jewish person and raise your children Jewish, but you are in a relationship with somebody who's Catholic. Like, I know they tell you not to mix religion in conversation, but it's a good analogy in that, because fundamentally that relationship might not work if that is what you believe. So you're putting yourself in an environment that's eventually it's going to blow up. Well, it's the same kind of scenario. Fundamentally, if you take something, right, that doesn't solve why your problem is there, your problem isn't going to go away. It's just going to manifest in different ways. It's the same thing in the relationship. Your problem's not going to go away if you ignore the fact that there's a fundamental breakdown in what you're looking for. It's just going to manifest in new and different ways, and it's just going to create more and more strife and more stress in your life, and that's not going to solve the issue either. So again, you got to go back to the origin. That's what functional medicine is. Those of you who haven't heard of functional medicine, this is what we're talking about. Functional medicine. Spread the word, spread the love. Functional medicine is what you want. It's root cause resolution. Those of you who are frustrated, who are tired, and the pills don't change, or maybe the pills do change, maybe the prescriptions change, but the symptoms don't really change, or you don't really get any better, and you're still looking for answers, and you're struggling, and you're frustrated, it's all because you haven't found the reason. Finding the reason is the number one thing that you can do if you want to overcome autoimmunity. Okay. I think we've gone over tonight, so we need to wrap it, folks. So, in wrapping it up, a couple different things. Number one, if you have not yet subscribed, hit that little bell, hit that button that says subscribe, and then hit that little bell and make sure you join me. We do new videos every Monday night with live Q&A. I also publish videos 3 other days during the week. So we are constantly providing you with information that you can utilize to help improve your health journey. So make sure you subscribe to our channel. Number 2, go visit me at glutenfreesociety.org. At the top of the page, you can sign up for our gluten-free survival guide. Make sure you just type in your name and email, get signed up for a gluten-free survival guide. If you really want to start navigating how to go gluten-free in a proper way, check that survival guide out. It's free, no charge to you. Number 2, go to glutenfreesociety.org. There's a little tab that says quiz. If you want to really get a general idea of whether or not going gluten-free might be helpful for you, take our free gluten-free quiz. It's a literally, you can take it in a few minutes. If the If the test results come back positive, that's when you want to consider yourself to be a candidate to get genetically tested and to get really true confirmation as to whether or not the gluten-free diet might be part of the solution on your journey to overcoming autoimmune disease. Look, this is Dr. Osborne wishing you all excellent health. Make sure you share, like, and comment below. Love to hear your stories and love to hear you helping other people by sharing this information. Have a great week, and we will see you next Monday.